Today, the risks of policy missteps worsen. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering funds and properties with a distinctively Australian flavour. Well, whether I'm a realist or a bear is something which often comes up in the comments after my shows. I actually believe I take the realist's view. It's just that the risks to the downside do seem to be boiling up. Believe it or not, despite what life throws at me, I remain an optimist. But there is much to be aware of just now, and I actually don't have much faith in the powers that be. And just before we start, a quick reminder that I'll be discussing the question of policy misstep tonight on my Tuesday evening live show at 8 p.m. Sydney time with Damien Classenley, Head of Investments at Nucleus Wealth and at Walk the World Fund. Because, of course, trying to make investment decisions in the current environment is, to say the least, challenging. The combination of high US inflation and Russia's invasion of Ukraine has discombobulated US markets. From Friday to Monday, traders effectively reduced the number of expected rate increases by the Federal Reserve to 6 from 7 by next February, even though by most accounts the inflation outlook has only worsened. The Fed has no good options, actually, and the market is reflecting the indecision that central bankers surely must feel. Europe's biggest ground conflict since World War II has sent energy prices soaring and shaken financial assets, stirring fears of stagflation that the US hasn't experienced since the 1970s. There are no great policy remedies for stagflation in normal times, and central bankers have few tools at their disposal with interest rates already close to zero. So predicting what they'll do is a job for mind readers and those with a crystal ball, not traders. Fed futures are currently pricing in 6 hikes by February 2023. Now, the market isn't blind to the price pressures across the economy. Break-even rates on 5-year Treasury notes, that's a measure of market expectations for inflation in that period, are actually increasing and drawing near the highest level in decades. One interpretation is that the market thinks the central bank will simply have to accept inflation running above its long-term target of 2%. Nothing about that scenario is positive, but the Fed may come to see it as the better of two bad choices. The alternative is crushing growth to try to rein in prices and probably bringing down the stock market in the process, and that isn't very palatable. And of course, higher inflation will effectively reduce the debt burden over time. Another reading of the market is that energy-fueled inflation simply isn't worth fighting, at least not by the Fed. The latest oil price dynamic report from the New York Fed says over the past week, a decrease in demand expectation was offset by a decrease in anticipated supply, resulting in higher oil prices. In the fourth quarter of 2021, oil prices decreased as increased anticipated supply outstripped the effect of an improving demand outlook. But according to Bloomberg, Brent crude oil prices around $100 a barrel aren't likely to persist for long and could be set for a big downturn. The cure for high energy prices is increasing production, including potentially from US shale producers sitting on the sidelines. But the levers of monetary policy at the Fed's disposal aren't likely to make a significant difference. And even if production doesn't ramp up to bring down prices, the Russian invasion of Ukraine may ultimately just accelerate the move away from oil and gas towards electric cars. Recessions, of course, are also great at cooling oil demand. In the near term, none of this spells good news for the US economy, but it does support the market's view that the Russian invasion hasn't made higher interest rates any more likely, and it may in fact have done the opposite. Some of this is reflected in the disjointed moves in daily bond yields recently. The 2-year Treasury yield plummeted 12 basis points on Monday. That's 0.12 percentage points, the biggest one-day drop in the year. The 10-year yield fell 9 basis points. Now, it's unclear how much of that truly reflects rate expectations and how much is just the famous investor flight to perceived safety, and the push and pull, of course, has been intense. There's one obvious problem with looking for monetary policy cues in financial markets. They're often wrong. There's a chance that the market is grossly underestimating the potential for rate increases. But the markets are getting one part of this narrative right. All of this is extremely complicated, and the likelihood of a policy misstep looks extremely high. Until the path ahead grows clearer, expect a lot of mixed messaging from the markets, significant volatility, and frankly, these times are confusing and traders, well, they don't have a crystal ball. But there is a worst case to consider. Putin cannot turn back now, possibly. Like many invaders before, he will continue in the attempt to avoid humiliation. Russian military power is such that it cannot be denied if, that is, Putin sees some point in taking a country he regards as Russian by destroying it. Russian behaviour in Syria provides an idea of what could happen. The Western financial upheaval, just to reinforce Russia's new pariah status, will be immense and painful. For example, news that BP plc will take a $25 billion hit to drop its stake in the huge Russian oil producer Rosneft in a painful strategic blow shows the scale of what's ahead. And sanctions are creating what looks like an incipient bank run in Russia as people try to get access to foreign currency when there's still a chance, while the effects on bonds and the ruble could be profound. And transport bans across Europe threaten to reintroduce the kind of problems created by the pandemic. And Putin's rationality looks very questionable at this point, and of course he's been hinting at the use of nuclear weapons. Or maybe the European Union will get its act together and the world's other autocrats decide to toe the line. The mad pro-Russian strain within American conservatism is decisively defeated, giving the US a credible centre-right party once more, while bringing the president a new lease of life. Well, and maybe, just maybe, this is the moment when Russia turns on Putin. My point is this: central banks have already messed up big time with quantitative easing as hell, the main game, creating asset inflation and wealth redistribution in favour of a few. But now a whole new level of chaos just got ladled in on top. So I reckon the chance of major policy missteps just got elevated, with profound implications for ordinary folks. And meantime, with attention fixed on the war raging in Ukraine, just days after the invasion by Russia, there's a greater than normal risk that the latest report from the coalition of top scientists on the UN-backed Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change will be overlooked, which is, in a way, something that the hundreds of authors worried about in compiling this 3,500-page report. Among the worst-case scenarios analysed for future warning is a world where, quote, a resurgent nationalism, concerns about competitiveness and security and regional conflicts makes global collaboration nearly impossible. The now released Climate Change 2020, Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability, focus on the interplay that connects warming-driven impacts such as heat waves and floods to ecosystems and human society. The IPCC scientists determined that some impacts are already irreversible, and that as many as 3.6 billion people are now living in settings that are highly vulnerable to climate change. The report characterises adaptation measures as far as halting and insufficient, and makes the consequences of inaction wretchedly clear. The world isn't reducing greenhouse gas emissions fast enough, which makes adapting to climate change more critical and also more difficult. And nations are moving too slowly to learn to live with destructive effects, leading to human hardship, not just in the future, but visible right now. Cue those floods down the east coast at the moment. Here are the 5 key arguments from the latest report on climate adaptation, or how humanity learns to live with warming temperatures. First, there's no more waiting for climate change, because climate-related impacts are already widespread and in some cases irreversible, according to the IPCC. Heat-related human mortality has risen. Extreme weather events and temperatures have exposed millions of people to food insecurity and malnutrition. Agricultural, tourism and other climate-sensitive sectors are seeing losses, and fisheries are in decline in some regions. Migration tied to climate shifts are rising. The previous version of the report from 2014 spent a lot of time on projected impacts. The new report noticeably devotes pages and pages to events that have already occurred. The whole idea that this is a distant issue in space or time or relevance, the new IPCC report shoots that right down, says Catherine Hayhoe, chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy. It says it's right here now, wherever you live, it is right now, not in the future, and it's affecting every aspect of our lives. Secondly, it is now adapt or die. Rich countries that are most responsible for carbon dioxide pollution have the most resources to prepare for its effects, whether or not they choose to do so. Poorer countries with little or no responsibility for climate change face the brunt of the assault and aren't receiving promised help from the developed world. The divide also holds within countries. Low-income and marginalised communities in prosperous nations are far more vulnerable than their immediate neighbours. It may sound hyperbolic to you, but my take is that for many vulnerable countries, it is now adapt or die, said Patrick Velgerhoff, Chief Executive Officer of the Netherlands-based Centre on Global Adaptation. The time for large-scale investments in adaptation is absolutely now. Rich countries can no longer leave the most vulnerable nations out to dry. The third point is that the clock is indeed ticking. Scientists have a word that describes what happens if nations miss their pollution limits and the world heats up past 1.5 degrees centigrade. Overshoot. Implicit in this idea is that by using nature or technology to draw down greenhouse gas levels, people can return the temperature back below the limit. But the new IPCC report warns that even if nations are able to do that, a big if of course, there will still be additional severe risks, some of which are irreversible compared to scenarios without overshoot. Up to 14% of land-based animal species are at risk of extinction once the 1.5 degrees centigrade threshold is passed, the IPCC warns. And this fact informs the physical limitation of climate adaptation and shapes the IPCC's guidance to reduce emissions as quickly as possible. Cuts today are much more valuable than the same cuts in 5 or 10 years' time. Fourth, what's needed beyond cutting emissions, because for emissions cuts, the task is clear. The world needs to reduce carbon dioxide emissions to zero by mid-century and halve the 2010 levels by 2030. The IPCC reported in 2018. But since some further warming is unavoidable, nations' preparedness matters a lot. Effective adaptation measures are critical. The problem is that efforts so far tend to be fragmented and short-term, according to the IPCC. Plus, adaptation efforts are often underfunded, and as warming increases, their effectiveness will go down. So what might the world look like after 2 degrees centigrade of warming above pre-industrial levels? The question can't be answered unless you also tell me what we are assuming about the condition of society, said Brian O'Neill, director of the Joint Global Change Research Institute in Maryland and a chief author of the report's chapter on future risks. And fifth, not enough is being done. The rate of global emissions growth had plateaued in the years before the pandemic, and inexpensive renewable power makes it possible to sharply curtail emissions. But atmospheric CO2 is not falling yet, and as the report makes clear, societies are not pursuing anything resembling the far-reaching changes they will need to do in order to protect themselves. Every fraction of a degree matters when it comes to impacts of climate change, said Stephanie Rowe, global lead scientist for climate and energy at the environmental non-profit WWF. So we can still reduce the effects or the impacts by effectively deploying adaptation measures. But the point I want to make is this, that all of the focus on the issue with regard to Europe and Russia and, of course, the COVID thing is masking this critical issue for the future. And unfortunately, the chances of our policy makers getting it all right is close to zero. So my take is simply this: the stakes are extremely high, the risks are very high, and the chances of a positive outcome on all fronts is, well, close to zero. So sorry to be a bearer of bad news. Call me a bear if you like, but I think I'm a realist. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.